first meeting of our committee since the beginning of our new term, so welcome committee members. We have Councilmember Mitchell Silver and Councilmember Megan Patton. I'm Jane Harrison. So we have one item today for discussion, and I'm just checking. I know there was a desire perhaps to be done by 5 p.m. if possible for other commitments. I think that's going to be doable here. The item is the UDO forestation requirements, and specifically related to the Urban Watershed Protection Overlay District in District B. So I'll turn it over to Nikki and your team.
Certainly. Thank you, Madam Chair. As you said, that we're going to talk about the urban watershed today, and we have Justin Remetta to give us some history and some context, and I believe he'll also provide some alternatives for the committee.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, committee members. Justin Remetta, Planning and Development. Again, here to speak with you about the urban watershed and the associated overlay district and the forestation requirements that apply therein. So just a little bit of background to start. What is the Urban Watershed Protection Overlay District, or UWPOD? It is one of 3 watershed protection overlay districts within the city's jurisdiction, the other 2 being Swift Creek, which drains Lakes Benson and Wheeler, and Falls Lake. It was created in 2005 when the state designated the Richland Creek watershed as a Class 4 watershed. That was done at the behest of the town of Wake Forest, who at the time had expressed an interest in using the intake at the old Burlington Mill site and the associated water supply as a potential source of drinking water. To date, that has not happened. Wake Forest nor other municipality or other jurisdiction uses this area as a drinking water supply. So it does differ from the other 2 reservoir watersheds in that regard. It also differs in that it is mostly developed or more so developed than the other 2 watersheds. It also contains a much larger percentage of higher density residential zoning, non-residential zoning, as compared to the mostly R1 large lot zoning that applies in Falls and Swift Creek. Like the other 2 watersheds, the urban watershed does contain regulations that require the forestation of lots and requires impervious surface limitations, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on those. Geographically, again, the urban watershed is shown here in the northeast portion of the city, generally bound by NC 98 to the north, Durant Road to the south, Falls of Neuse and Old Falls of Neuse Road to the west, and US 1 and the Neuse River to the east. It's about 4,600 acres. Again, does contain quite a large variety of zoning, all the way from R1 through R10. Also, a significant portion is zoned planned development, with the Falls River development making up a large portion of the watershed as well. So as I mentioned, there are forestation requirements that apply. These apply in all 3 watersheds that require 40% of any individual lot to be forested. Forested can mean planting or preservation of trees, so it does differ from our tree conservation rules a little bit in that regard, that are only about the preservation of existing trees. These requirements can be met with plantings as well. There are also some prescriptive standards about the size of those trees, where on the lot they can be, how many stands of trees, et cetera. As mentioned, there are also stormwater requirements. Those are primarily buffer yards that apply along certain water courses, and impervious surface limits that range from 24% up to 70%, depending on whether you provide stormwater controls and which area of the watershed it's in. Did want to note that 70% maximum impervious, as you might realize, conflicts with the requirement for 40% forestation, right? You can't have both. 110. Correct. Yes. So given recent interest in potentially revising these forestation requirements. As you all know, there's an individual homeowner had some difficulty complying with the regulations. That is not at all uncommon. The Board of Adjustment has processed about 70 variances.
How many?
70.
70.
Since
For
two,
this watershed.
for this watershed alone, to these forestation requirements. That would be since the rules were implemented in 2013.
Would you just say, were those variances approved, the 70?
All but one have been approved.
And a second question. Do you know, you started at 30% or less. Do you know where they ended up per lot? Because I'm trying to see where the 30% came from. You said or less. Of those 70, where did they end up? Was it 30%, 25%, or do you have that information?
Yeah, I don't have exact information. I will say the 30% here that we're recommending doesn't have to be 30%. We're recommending no more than 30%. If nothing else, that would resolve that conflict with the 70% allowance for stormwater. Most of the variances that have been granted have been for complete relief because they are mostly small, single-family lots that were platted before the watershed was implemented. So think 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 square foot lots that just don't have room at all to build a house and have any type of yard and provide 40% forestation. So I can go into detail on each of these potential options. So option one, again, would be to reduce to 30% or less, so no greater than 30%. That again, resolves that conflict with the impervious surface allowances. We would include some statement about or how to handle the existing nonconformities. We don't believe this would create any new nonconformities, as this would be a more permissive change, but just being mindful of recent changes in state law. From a technical perspective, it's a relatively simple drafting process to amend the UDO that way. Obviously, a 30% could still be a potentially high burden for some of those smaller lots. You may continue to see those variance requests and compliance issues with this option. Option two, we're calling a tiered approach. It's more accurate maybe to say perhaps just to carve out some exemptions. So again, we would recommend going no greater than 30%, but you could carve out exemptions, for example, small lot residential developments, so to kind of address the properties that have had the most difficulty in compliance. You could leave that 30% or some other percentage in place for large lot residential and non-residential lots. That reduces that burden of compliance again, especially for those smaller lots that have had the most issues, and you still are able to retain some level of future planting and preservation in the watershed. Third option would be to just remove the forestation requirement in its entirety. That is not unprecedented. That would return to the standard that was in place between 2005 and 2013 when the UDO was adopted. Obviously, that absolves and addresses any issues with nonconformities or compliance, but leaves you with no forestation regulations in the watershed, although they would continue to apply in Falls and Swift Creek. So that concludes my presentation. I hope that was helpful. I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I'm interested in hearing from Councilmember Patton about your experience, with residents on this one.
Yeah, for sure. So I can open up with a little bit of preamble, and then I do have some questions, but also just like for any of the 4 viewers watching at home who might like to think I'm coming for all the trees. So I was approached by a resident who lives in this neighborhood. They had experienced a house fire. It was a total loss, and they want to rebuild the same house, the house with the same footprint, and they have not been able to, and they had to go through a variance process. And while they're doing this, they're continuing to pay their mortgage and also paying rent on the temporary dwelling, the apartment they're living in until their home is rebuilt. And so this has proven to be very onerous. And it seemed to me when I was presented with this that this is not really in the spirit of the code that I don't think anyone wrote like, okay, let's account for 110% of people's properties so that everyone has to go through a variance to, so I think a lot of times we think the code is for like capital D developers only, and this is a situation where this is a regular person trying to rebuild the same size house that they lived in before. And so I just wanted to evaluate whether we find the value of this so high that it's worth putting residents through a really difficult and onerous process. It is not my desire to do something very sweeping, but kind of rather look at if there's a solution that's agreeable to everyone, that's pretty narrowly crafted to eliminate this pain point while still preserving the trees. So that's kind of like my preamble and backstory of how we got here and why I asked for the item to be taken up. With that, I do have some questions. Out of the 70 variances, 69 of which were approved, how many are kind of quite similar in profile to this resident trying to rebuild essentially the same house?
Don't have that exact number. I think it's fair and safe to say a vast majority of them have been, again, small, single-family lots, most of them platted before these regulations were in place, and thus just have no way of complying.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So, and would you say that, is it like safe to say that most of the lots inside of this watershed would already be considered non-conforming, like they are not 40 or even 30% forested at this time?
Many would be, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I probably have more, but.
Councilmember Silver.
Well, I want to first thank Councilmember Patton to bring this to our attention. I think anytime you have 70 variances, there's a problem. So I'm grateful we're having this conversation. I guess I want to start on the other extreme, your third option. Can you kind of talk about, so people understand the worst case scenario, if all of those, we remove the forestation requirement for the urban watershed entirely, many parts of it, as you stated, already built, granted low density in some cases. So just so that those that understand, right now we have the status quo. The other extreme is to follow option number 3. How, so people understand, would that play itself out over the next 20 years?
Sure. So I think it's, you would see clearly, so these regulations would go away, no longer apply. The code, the other regulations in the code that in regards to planting and landscapings would continue to apply. So lots greater than 2 acres that subdivide or developed would be subject to tree conservation rules. Non-residential developments would have parking lot landscaping, buffer requirements, perimeter buffers, those sorts of things. The stormwater requirements for stream buffers would still be in place. And so the requirements for street trees, planting with new developments, those sorts of things.
So the public would understand that option 3 wouldn't mean that there are no regulations. The regulations that apply to non-watershed areas of how most property in Raleigh that is developed, they would accept those rules.
That's correct.
If I might, Councilmember Silver, Pat Young with Planning and Development, just to add to what Justin just said and to emphasize something he said early on. This was designated as a water supply watershed in 2005. Right. This is prior to the time when Wake Forest became a merger community with the city of Raleigh, so they now use our water supply sources. There is no plans, no expectation, no vision, no intention to use this area as a water supply watershed. So I just want to emphasize there would be no impact on water supply by any change that was made here.
Right. And the intent, I'm sure people may know the watershed, is that you want to limit the type of development because you want it to help feed potentially a reservoir. This one, in fact, is a watershed with no reservoir, if I read your statement correctly. So I'm starting for the point that You know, I was here in 2005. For some reason, I don't remember this. I arrived at 2005, and I don't recall this conversation in the UDO. But I'm going to kind of start as we have this conversation. I think change is warranted. I'm kind of leaning toward right now just option 3, unless there's a compelling reason, just what the planning director said, to see where we kind of end up. I'm guessing somewhere in the middle, but to me, just to ensure there's no burden, that we still have our ordinance that addresses all the important needs as it comes to our natural environment, from stormwater to tree protection, et cetera. So I'm just starting at that point, but thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, I guess I want to jump in here, a couple items. First, for any of our viewers at home, the idea of the urban watershed, this is a very specific watershed, as was shown in the map, only in District B. This is not a typology or category that you see in the rest of the city. That was something I got a little confused about, just because the title, urban, to me, I thought might affect other areas, but it is a very limited area. I personally would not support option 3 at this time. I'd like to see option 1 or 2 explored. And one of the reasons for that is that we have been stalled on numerous occasions in thinking about adding additional tree protections, particularly for parcels under 2 acres across the city, because of legislative authority concerns. And I think if we could have, a slightly higher model here, that to me is not a bad thing. So I'm not prepared to go to I'm going to call it the least common denominator, but if we could look at option 1 or 2, that's something I might be amenable to. I also have a question on process. Nikki, do you know, because we have 3 individuals here, does a vote of 2 out of 3, does that move forward to council, or do we need all of us? 2 out of 3 is enough?
Majority of the people present.
Okay, just making sure in case we have any disagreements there. I also would like to hear, I think, from Whit Wheeler, and maybe if he's not here today, at least if this comes back to council, about the intention around the water supply shed. I agree. Everything I understand is that this is not going to be used as a water supply shed. In my role on the Upper Neuse River Basin Association, which manages Falls Lake, I know what kind of our backups are, and this is not one of them.
Yeah. So I agree. We have precious little authority over the remaining trees, and so I'm reluctant to be too permissive. I would, we know that part of why we don't build in the other watersheds, or why we build really low density, the alternative is a lot of nutrient treatment in the processing plant, and so this helps us treat the nutrients naturally. But I do see stormwater staff in the audience, and another thing that trees do is filter the stormwater so that it can go back into the ground, and that's what we would rather happen than it rush off into a storm drain. Wayne, what are the pros and cons of any movement on this from a stormwater standpoint?
Hey, Wayne Miles, Stormwater Manager, Engineering Services. So in terms of the state regulations, they just look at impervious area and density of development. They don't look at a tree reforestation requirement. So any decision here would not impact DEQ's perspective of this. This is, a City of Raleigh decision. The main impact of forestation that we see from stormwater is volume. We do know that trees help infiltration into the soil because the root systems provide paths for infiltration. We do know that trees have evapotranspiration that helps dry out the soil faster, so that gives their more infiltration capacity for stormwater. So that's the main implication from a stormwater perspective, is more trees means less stormwater volume. From a water quality standpoint, which is obviously important here, The difference is more difficult to define. It depends on what the pervious area is used for. For example, if you remove trees and just leave it as open area, it's not manicured, the water quality impacts are probably not as significant. If it was turned into a manicured lawn where it was fertilized with nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and a manicured grass, that could obviously have nutrient implications in terms of what was running off from that site. So that would be the main implication there from a water quality standpoint.
And on lots this size, most of these are pretty small lots, although I think there's commercial in here too, but the difference between 30 and 40 is like a single tree, maybe?
Yeah, so if only the forestation requirement was changed, it would not change the stormwater control requirements, which is based on the impervious area, if that makes sense.
Okay. It doesn't. I'm sorry. Let me be honest. It didn't. Can you say it again? I didn't catch it.
Yeah, so I think we're looking at changing the forestation requirement. Right now, it's 40%.
Yeah.
Okay, which creates a conflict if you're allowing up to 70%. Stormwater controls are, in the regulations, are based on the impervious area, not the tree forestation area.
Okay. So
Okay.
if we don't change the impervious, nothing.
If you
about
didn't change the
situation.
stormwater requirements for the impervious area, it would only have, the implications as I described of what would that pervious area be used for? Would it be trees? Would it be manicured lawns, et cetera?
I got it. Okay. I got it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So I have a question. Since circumstances have changed with Wake Forest, this was designated an urban watershed protection overlay. I'm trying to reconcile, is this truly a watershed protection overlay, or is this a tree conservation protection overlay? I'm just trying to reconcile because this is different than the other two. This watershed is different, so I'm not saying I'm opposed to the other, I'm just trying to reconcile in my mind. Does this truly live up to the expectation of a watershed, or are we more talking about a tree conservation protection overlay district?
Pat Young again with Planning and Development. It's a good question. I would characterize it as a water supply watershed in name only because of the fact of, as you can see from this map, that the lotting pattern makes it make it very difficult to treat and manage water supply because there's already so much authorized impervious in the basin. That being said, it is legally designated as a water supply watershed and therefore provides the authorization to do the forestation requirement. But again, no plans, no vision or intention to use it as a water supply watershed.
Yeah. Maybe questions for Justin. Do you know off the top of your head when Falls River was built, the neighborhood?
Do not. I could
90s?
easily find that out. I think the planned development was in the early to mid-90s, the rezoning to planned development.
Got it.
Yeah.
So 20 years before the watershed was put on top of it. Okay. And then can you go to option number 2? So option number 1 is just resolve the conflict for everyone. Option 2 sounds like it's a little more narrow and it creates carve-outs. Can you just flesh it out? Say a little more about what this could look like?
Yeah, so I think at its most, in the simplest sense, right, I think you could say that small lot residential has had the most difficulties in complying with the 40% forestation, right? And so what you could do is simply take those properties out. Not out of the watershed, but out of the requirement, right? And just exempt them. And then you maintain some percentage, whether that's 40, 30, 20, 25, for other lots. So you would still continue to see forestation apply to the non-residential developments and to the large lot residential developments.
Okay. And so then those people would still be faced with a conflict, and we'd need to, on the larger lots, they would need to resolve that through the variance process?
I think we would still recommend, if you're going to change anything, we regardless would recommend resolving that 70 versus 40 conflict. So with option 2, we would recommend basically a flat-out exemption entirely for small lot residential, leave the requirement in place for commercial and large lot residential, but reduce it to 30.
Oh, got it. Okay.
If I might quickly add to that again, Pat Young with Planning and Development. To put a fine point on what Justin said, of the 70 variance requests we've had since 2013, over 90% of those have been less than 1 acre residential lots. So option 1, while resolving the conflict inherent in these regulations, would not substantially reduce the cost of compliance and the compliance burdens that we've discussed, because lots that are finding it challenging to have 40% forestation, say the average lot, and this is between a 1/4 acre and a 1/2 acre, closer to a 1/4 acre. Would be very difficult to comply. So I think that was part of the intention in crafting this, was to give you an option that would reduce the situation like you described with your constituent with the house that burned, while still catching, commercial developments, gas stations, strip centers, other things like that, which do exist in this watershed.
All right. I guess if there's no more questions, we should probably bring it back to us and talk about which of these is most amenable.
Yeah, if anyone has a motion or wants to bring one of these options forward.
Before we vote, I do find the latter 2 options appealing, because I think we all recognize something needs to get done. I am struggling whether this truly lives up to what is a watershed, and that's where I'm struggling a bit.
Can I just say it is a watershed, but it's not a water supply
It's
watershed.
not a water supply watershed, and so I'm just trying to understand the intent, because I recognize I was here when we were moving forward to permit the Little River and having conversations with all the surrounding jurisdictions, and that was a very, very painful process for the purpose of knowing that we were going to truly have a water supply. This one is not that, so I'm struggling a bit between, yes, it's not a water supply watershed, and I don't want to use it to get de facto tree conservation overlay, so that's where I'm somewhat stuck. So I can imagine this is going forward, but I'm going to still default to option 3 to keep the conversation going forward on kind of the lines that I've been asking staff. So I will not make a motion because I suspect it's going to fail.
You're reading the room.
I think my instinct is option 2, to resolve the conflict for all the lots by making it 30% forestation, and then looking at these small lots that are similar to the situation my constituent faced, where meeting these forestation requirements is quite onerous, and I would maybe, this would be just authorizing a text change process to begin, so we would just be allowing a public process to begin. And so perhaps in that such authorization, staff could look at what these variances have been approved, what is attainable for the folks living. I mean, these are 1/4 acre lots, like what is really reasonable, understanding that anywhere else in the city that's not in a water supply or in a watershed, a 1/4 acre lot is gonna have no tree conservation obligations. But maybe we can look at what the variances were requested and what was approved and find a 25% or 20% for the small lot residential scenario.
I do have one question. Patrick, I don't know if you know this answer. I'm just trying to get the public to understand and characterize what generally, all those variances requested, is this an addition? Is this a pool? Is it a wider driveway? Just trying to understand when a homeowner wants to do something, can you characterize, and I know 70 is going to be a big variety, generally what they're asking for, one. Number two, to the public to understand both time and cost of pursuing a variance, to understand that burden and uncertainty. While 70% was improved, you just don't know. It's quasi-judicial, so there are findings of fact, and so I'm sure you may have to hire an attorney. So there's a cost to going through a variance process, both time and money. So can you, one, characterize generally what these are for, and then secondly, any indication on average of cost? Do they need an attorney? And then how long that takes?
Sure. Thanks, Councilmember. That's a really good question. I think the average process from submittal to hearing by the Board of Adjustment is right about 6 months. In addition to the time is uncertainty, as I think you alluded to, right? Because this is, even though it's what's called a quasi-judicial hearing, which means that if there's a facts determined, it has to be granted, it creates that uncertainty. So an attorney is strongly recommended, and most applicants do have an attorney to ensure that evidence can be provided and things of that nature. In terms of cost, a land use attorney is in the range of $300 an hour, right? So that's an average. That could be higher or lower. And then the application and the submittal is what? Yeah, $300. But the real cost is the time and the expertise needed to present the variance findings to the Board of Adjustment. So it is, in my judgment, it's a substantial burden. As Justin mentioned, many applicants have requested total relief from the forestation requirement so that they have maximum flexibility on their site design, right? They may want to put in a shed or play area, driveway, things of that nature. Certainly you all could designate a lower amount that you felt was more feasible. We could certainly get you some information. I don't have that handy, but most of these lots would have to be planted, right? Because they've been previously clear cut when they were platted, most of them. And so that's another cost to the homeowner, but certainly available to you as an option. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Yeah. Okay, I'm done.
So yeah, and then just to restate, I think I'm going to motion forward option 2. So we'll resolve the 40 and 70 conflict for everyone, and then we'll offer some lower requirement for the small lot residential, and we'll, I guess, ask staff to bring us back a recommendation of a reasonable lower percentage somewhere between 30 and 0. I don't mind it. If you want to put in a shed, but then you have to plant like a couple of bushes, I think I'm okay with the trade-off there.
So just to clarify, if you could move back to option 2, what your motion is saying is that the percentage could be anywhere between 0 and 30% for large lot residential and commercial lots?
No. So for the large lots, 30%.
Okay, keep that.
Yeah. For the small lots, we'd ask staff to bring us back a recommendation on what that threading of the needle is. So maybe for the small lots, it's 15% or 10%, so that people can widen their driveways or put in their decks without having to go through the variance process. But the large lots and the commercial would be 30%.
So just restating, it would be an exemption with some new percentage under, well, anywhere from 0 to 30% forestation for the small lots. Okay, so it's a little different than what's here. Are y'all just making sure you've got that motion?
Yeah, I think we had drafted this as just exempting small lots, but we're certainly happy to bring back options for both that and then somewhere in between 0 and 30% as well.
Okay. Yeah. I'll go ahead and second that. All in favor of the motion on the table? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, that was 2 out of 3, so I believe the motion carries.
I believe so. Could you restate the motion again, just so
So we
everyone's
will
clear?
send this back to the city council with a recommendation to authorize a text change that reduces forestation to 30% for large lot and commercial, and creates a lower requirement for small lot residential.
So not to exempt the small lots. That's,
I think Justin was saying he could bring back up maybe option A and option B, because then the council will still have to authorize the text change. So then the council can authorize text change A or B.
It's at your discretion. If you want to, if you're not comfortable, if you're with a flat out exemption, that can be part of your motion. But if you are, then we can bring back several options ranging from 0 to 30%.
and as a point of clarification on the process, does it go straight to the full council or does it go to the planning commission?
Because we have to authorize, the council will authorize the text change, and then it'll go through the process, and planning commission will hear it, and then it'll be approved by the council in a year to 18 months from now. Okay. Yeah, so did I get it wrong? It wouldn't take that long. It wouldn't take that long, okay. I was being generous.
All right, I think we've,
So I would say an option A and an option B. An option with a full exemption for small lots, and an option with a middling reduced requirement. Yeah.
okay.
Clear.
I think we've made some progress here, at least as a recommendation back to the full council. We'll see how the full council discussion goes. I appreciate the information. Thank you all today, and the conversation among the committee. With that, I am going to adjourn.